Hi, I'm Sam Hawley, coming to you from Gadigal land. This is ABC News Daily. At the height of the pandemic, many Australians found themselves with less work and struggling to make ends meet. So they jumped at the chance to access their retirement savings early. Now we know a lot more about what they spent the money on, with a new study showing gambling was high on the list. Today we speak to one of the researchers and chat to two women who will now have a lot less in their super funds when they retire.
So I'm Courtney, I'm 35, I work in film and I live in Melbourne. I've got a partner and a dog. So I had obviously having a bit of a tough time through COVID, and I was in a little bit of debt. So I thought I would just take out 10 grand from my super and pay it off. And I regret it now because I said to myself I would pay back that 10 grand as soon as I could, and I haven't, and I will probably do it with my tax return this year. Because I'm from England, I've been in the country 7 years, so I didn't have an insane amount of money in my super. I didn't completely deplete my super, but yeah. And looking back now, like I do have regrets and I don't have regrets. Like I know I will probably, when I get older, if I'm not able to put that money back in, but at the time it was really useful.
My name is Rhiannon. I live on the Gold Coast. I'm married with 2 children. I'm a nurse. I work for Queensland Health. My husband's a chef, so at that point in time, his work had completely disappeared. Having 2 children and a mortgage and only one income obviously makes things a little bit stressful. My income was enough basically just to cover all of our outgoing bills. But day-to-day living obviously became a little bit more tight and a bit more stressful, not having that second income to, keep us a head above water, I say. I took out 10,000 and it would be a quarter of what I had in my super at the time. It was probably the only way for us to survive at that time, just to keep our family going.
Hi, I'm Steven Hamilton, Assistant Professor of Economics at George Washington University in Washington, D.C.
Stephen, we've been speaking to 2 women who took out some of their super during the pandemic. It's money that they wouldn't have been allowed to touch if it wasn't for the former Prime Minister, Scott Morrison.
Yeah, so almost 3 years ago in 2020, I'm sure people can remember the early developments of the pandemic. Events progressed very rapidly. We didn't really know what to do. We didn't have an instruction manual for how to deal with a pandemic. Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg came out just about every week announcing a new stimulus package to support the economy through the pandemic. The super withdrawal program was the middle plank of 3 economic stimulus.
The government's giving eligible Australians early access to their superannuation, $10,000 this financial year and another $10,000 the next, all tax-free.
This is the people's money.
The idea, I think, at the time was that, every Australian has this big pool of cash. Mm-hmm. Everyone is forced to save 10% of their income. The idea is you get it in retirement. But the thought was we'll give them this temporary access to their superannuation up to $20,000 per person. Mm-hmm. And that would help them get through the pandemic and also minimise the upfront cost to government. Around 2.5 million people decided to do this. And in total, they removed about $38 billion from their super accounts.
That's not really what super was designed for, was it? When Paul Keating developed it, it was not meant to be touched until retirement, and he really lashed out at the decision at the time, saying it meant that young people would be bearing the brunt of bailing out the economy.
Yeah, this kind of goes to the heart of the question.
Instead of job seeker and job keeper carrying the main burden of income support from the get-go, the main burden of income support is people, ratting their own savings.
Superannuation, which began in the early 80s, was made compulsory in the early 90s, was designed to make sure that people put money away up front so that when they reached retirement, they would have enough money to support themselves in retirement. And just as importantly, it would mean that the federal government wouldn't have a huge liability that it faced to try and fund these people in their retirement. Now, obviously, the super withdrawal scheme kind of reverses that. It says to people, no, actually, we're going to allow you to use this money when you're much younger. And in fact, in the pandemic, we saw that the most common age was about 34 years old. So it was by and large taken up by much younger people.
So 3 years on, we now have a much better idea of how many Australians withdrew super at this time. You've already mentioned a lot of them were quite young, in their 30s. But what else have you learned?
Yeah, it's quite staggering, 3 years on to understand how much data we have available to us. We can see really anything about these people, what they were earning every week, what they were spending on every week, their access to government payments. And what we see is a couple of striking things. One is that the people who decided to withdraw were not that much lower income than the people who didn't. They had slightly lower wages, but not much. They weren't, on average, suffering a temporarily low wage period. It's not like, it was particularly people who were in need at that moment. But those people had much worse financial circumstances. So they were people with, 75% lower savings, people with 80% lower dividends, people who were making 90% less voluntary contributions to super. So in general, their financial health was much worse than the people who didn't withdraw, which I guess is not a surprise.
That makes sense.
Yes. And then what we see is the people who opted into the program, around 1 in 6 people on average, 1 in 4 34-year-olds, they spent the money very quickly. So we see that roughly 45%, nearly half of the money was spent. And when we say spent, that means, there was a debit on their account. It wasn't an external transfer. It wasn't money paid off debt. It was spending within 8 weeks. So spending increased by 130% over the first 2 weeks, roughly 45% over 8 weeks. And then after that time, spending returned to normal. And we see them spending on a range of categories. The largest category was ATM withdrawals, cash, and the second largest category was somewhat surprisingly gambling expenditure. Right. And in fact, we see gambling spending on average around the same level as credit card repayments. So that's kind of the key takeaway that we see from the spending results.
I mean, the women we have spoken to, they really needed that money, one, to pay off debt, but another woman to actually make ends meet and to put food on the table because they were one whole income down during this period.
Yeah, so this is really, really important point. So what we notice on average is that people who withdrew their super on average, weren't experiencing a reduction in their wage relative to before. Now, of course, there are going to be cases where people were, but overwhelmingly that wasn't the case.
Okay, so before we move on, I just want to know, how on earth do you know all of that information? That people are withdrawing money from ATMs, that they're gambling the money they're taking out. It seems like quite sort of personal information. So how have you gone about looking into that?
Yeah, so we've been working on this since mid-2020. Nothing is identifiable. So the information we have is all de-identified. It's anonymized. So we have roughly 15 million working age Australians. We have access to all of their government kind of related information. That means their tax returns, their welfare information, their super information. And then we have a sample of roughly 700,000 Australians' bank account transactions de-identified. So we just see Jane Doe, spent on these things, in this week, withdrew super at this point, and then next week spent this money on that. And so we look at this sample of individuals and we can study how their behaviour evolves.
And do you know from your data where most of we're talking a huge amount of people here, 2.6 million Australians, and of course they're not all using it on gambling, we're not saying that.
No.
But do you get a sense of where they were living, where these people lived? Were they clustered in a certain area? Do you have any information on that?
Yeah, so it's quite interesting. So what we do have is withdrawal rates by location. Now, the highest withdrawing suburbs of the top 20, almost all of them are in Queensland. I'm a Queenslander myself. The highest withdrawing suburb is the very tip of Cape York in Queensland, a remote community there. And we do observe across the country that very high withdrawal rates in suburbs with what we would call high levels of socioeconomic disadvantage. That means low levels of higher education, low levels of income, high levels of unemployment. So that meant, outer suburban, rural, regional areas tended to withdraw much more, and areas that are very affluent, highly educated, tended to withdraw a lot less.
So let's discuss the losses, because in the scheme of things, across someone's entire life, is $20,000 really that much?
Yeah, so this is another problem, which is this is in fact the reason why super exists in the first place, because people tend to have difficulty translating current values into their future value. If a 34-year-old removed $20,000, which is the most common withdrawal amount, then they can expect at retirement at 65 for their super balance to be $120,000 lower in today's dollars than if they hadn't withdrawn that $20,000.
It's a lot.
So that's a huge impact, right? That's not a small impact. The median super balance of someone who's currently 50 is about 200,000. So that's kind of like half their super balance wiped out.
Wow. On
average, the people who withdrew removed more than 50% of their current super balance. So actually, even though it's only 20,000, it's really quite a dramatic impact on their super balance. And we don't know whether people understood that.
So, Stephen, given that long-term impact, and as you say, many people might not have been aware of that impact, do you think something like this should ever be allowed to happen again?
Yeah, so I'm forgiving of the decision to do it in the first place. What we can do now is look in hindsight and we can observe what actually happened. And I think with the benefit of hindsight, unwinding that concept of mandatory super for long run kind of benefits, I think was a mistake, and I wouldn't do it again.
Steven Hamilton is an economist at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Under the current scheme, Australians are allowed to withdraw some super on compassionate grounds, including for medical treatment or palliative care. This episode was produced by Flint Duxfield, Sam Dunn and Chris Dengate, who also did the mix. Our supervising producer is Stephen Smiley. I'm Sam Hawley. ABC News Daily will be back again tomorrow. Thanks for listening.